A $3 bill is supposed to be the punchline of a joke, the standard American shorthand for something obviously fake. So hold that thought while I describe a real one. In the standard collector's catalog of obsolete American paper money, there is a genuine, engraved, bank-issued $3 note printed in 1838 by an institution called the Bank of Singapore. Not Singapore, the city in Asia. Singapore, Michigan, a lumber settlement at the mouth of the Kalamazoo River on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, a town that no longer exists. The buildings are gone. The streets are gone. The entire settlement lies buried under sand dunes. But the money it printed survives, and the money tells the story. On its face, that note promised to pay the bearer $3 in gold or silver coin on demand at the bank's office. In practice, a merchant in New York holding that same piece of paper in 1838 might have gotten 50 cents on the dollar for it, or nothing at all. Same note, same week. The value depended entirely on how far you were standing from a wooden building in the Michigan woods. And here is the part almost nobody learns in school. For roughly 25 years, from 1837 until the middle of the Civil War, this was not a scandal at the edge of the American economy. This was the American economy. The United States government printed no national paper currency at all. Every paper dollar in the country was issued by a private, state-chartered bank, and by the count of the Standard Reference Catalog, roughly 3,000 different banks issued their own notes in tens of thousands of distinct designs. In the next 20 or so minutes, I'm going to show you how that system actually worked, why the Bank of Singapore was placed exactly where it was on purpose, which is a stranger reason than you expect, how one Chicago company legally forbidden to be a bank issued paper that traded better than gold, and how Congress finally killed the whole system without ever banning a single banknote. That last detail matters, because the weapon they used instead of a ban is still on the books. Here is exactly what this episode will walk through. First, the Singapore note itself, the precise promise engraved on its face and why that promise was designed to depend on a road that barely existed. Second, the mechanism, the Michigan General Banking Law of 1837 that let nearly anyone with a bundle of bonds open a bank and print money, and the inspection trick that state examiners fell for again and again. Third, 3 case studies from opposite ends of the system. The wildcat banks of the Michigan frontier, the Boston Bank that quietly disciplined every banknote in New England without any law behind it, and the insurance company in Chicago whose certificates became, by some contemporary estimates, the majority of the money circulating in that city. Fourth, the 5 moves Congress made between 1862 and 1866, ending with a 10% tax that erased thousands of private currencies in under 2 years. And fifth, the part the textbooks skip entirely, that the private money machine did not actually die in 1866. It changed shape, and you almost certainly used its modern descendant sometime today. This channel traces the machinery underneath American money and power, the systems that ran things before the versions we were taught. Every claim in this episode rests on period bank commissioner reports, the note catalogs, and the statutes themselves, and where historians estimate rather than count. I will say so. Start with the object. The Bank of Singapore's notes were, physically, beautiful. That surprises people. These were not crude frontier script. They were produced by professional engraving firms in the East, the same class of firms that would later print money for the federal government, with ornate lathework borders, allegorical figures, sailing ships, and denominations spelled out in elegant script. The beauty was the business model. A note that looked authoritative circulated, a note that circulated did not come home, and a note that never came home never had to be paid. Read the actual text on the face and the whole game is visible in one sentence. The bank promises to pay $3 to the bearer on demand at its banking house in Singapore, Michigan. Every word is load-bearing, not $3 anywhere. $3 there. In 1838, getting to Singapore, Michigan meant a lake schooner in season or a slog through forest and swamp, and the town's handful of structures served a lumber operation, not a financial district. Now follow one of those notes through an ordinary sequence. A mill hand on the Kalamazoo is paid his wages in Singapore paper. He spends it at a store in the settlement where it passes at face value, because locally everyone accepts it. The storekeeper bundles his notes and sends them with a shipment to a wholesaler in Detroit. In Detroit, the paper is recognized but distrusted, and it passes at a discount, perhaps 90 cents on the dollar. The wholesaler's creditor in Buffalo takes it at 80. By the time the note reaches a money broker on Wall Street, the broker pulls out a weekly publication, finds the Bank of Singapore in a long alphabetical table of banks, reads the quoted discount or the single damning word listed beside its name, and offers 50 cents or declines it outright. Nobody along that chain was being irrational. Each person was pricing one question: what would it actually cost me to travel to a lumber camp in Michigan and demand coin at the counter? The distance was the discount. And when Michigan's banking system convulsed in the panic years of the late 1830s, dozens of these frontier banks folded. Their notes went to zero in the hands of whoever was holding them last, and the losers were, overwhelmingly, the wage earners and small merchants furthest from the information. Which is precisely why the story of one drowned lumber town is not a curiosity. Multiply that note by tens of thousands of designs and 3,000 issuers, and you are looking at the monetary operating system of the United States for a generation. So how does a country end up here, with money as a private product and geography as its exchange rate? The one-sentence version is this: states sold the legal right to print money to anyone who could post collateral, and the collateral was very often the state's owed debt. Rewind to 1836. President Andrew Jackson had spent years at war with the Second Bank of the United States, the closest thing the country had to a central bank, and that year its federal charter expired. Into the vacuum stepped the states. In 1837, Michigan passed what historians generally regard as the first general banking law in the country, and New York followed with its own Free Banking Act in 1838. The word free did not mean money was free. It meant entry was free. Before this, opening a bank required a specific charter from a state legislature, which in practice meant political connections and often outright bribery. The free banking laws replaced the legislature with a formula: deposit approved bonds with the state as security, satisfy some minimum requirements, and you may open a bank and issue circulating notes. In theory, the design was self-policing. If the bank failed, the state would sell the bonds and redeem the notes. In practice, the theory had holes you could drive a lumber wagon through. Hole number 1. The bonds were frequently valued at face value while trading in the market well below it, so a bank could be born already insolvent, its notes backed by collateral worth a fraction of the paper issued against it. Hole number 2. The redemption obligation was local, payable only at the banking house, which is how remoteness became an asset. Contemporaries coined a name for banks allegedly sited where the wildcats roamed, out past where any noteholder would bother to travel, and the name stuck to the whole era: wildcat banking. Hole number 3 was the inspection problem, and here the primary sources are almost comic. Michigan's own bank commissioners, in their official report to the legislature in 1839, described discovering that the gold and silver they had been shown at one bank was the same gold and silver they had counted at another. Specie was being hauled through the forest ahead of the examiners, bank to bank, arriving just before the inspection and leaving just after. The commissioners wrote, in words that still sting, that coin flew about the country with something like the speed of magic, heard in the depths of the forest, yet no one could say where it came from or where it went. One traveling chest of coin could stand behind 5 banks' worth of promises. And sitting on top of this entire structure was a private information industry that most Americans have never heard of, which is where the system gets genuinely strange. Because if you were a shopkeeper in 1850 in Cincinnati or Albany or New Orleans, every single transaction was a test. A customer hands you a $5 note from a bank you have never heard of, in a state you have never visited. Is it real? Is the bank alive? And what is it worth today? The answer came from a genre of weekly publications called banknote reporters and counterfeit detectors, and the most famous of them, Thompson's Banknote Reporter, published out of New York, functioned as something like a stock ticker for money itself. Page after page of bank names, each with a quoted discount, half of 1% for a solid nearby bank, 10, 25, 50% for distant or shaky ones, and beside the dead ones, notations amounting to worthless. Merchants kept the latest issue under the counter the way a modern shop keeps a card reader. Now 3 cases that show the system's full range. Case 1. The wildcat frontier at its worst is Michigan itself. Under the 1837 law, historians count roughly 50 banks organized in the first flush of enthusiasm, many in settlements that were little more than survey stakes, and within a few years the large majority had failed or been wound up, with the panic of 1837 and the collapse of 1839 doing much of the killing. Singapore's bank was an early casualty, its notes joining a mass of Michigan paper that the reporters marked down and then marked dead. The losses landed hardest on exactly the people the notes had paid, laborers and farmers holding paper they had accepted in good faith at full value. Case 2 is the opposite pole, and it is the case that complicates every simple story about this era. New England. Notes in New England circulated at or near face value across 6 states, and the reason was not a law. It was one private institution, the Suffolk Bank of Boston. Beginning in the 1820s, the Suffolk built a system with a blunt lever. Country banks were pressed to keep a deposit with the Suffolk, and in exchange the Suffolk cleared their notes at par. Any bank that refused found the Suffolk collecting its notes in bulk and presenting them for immediate redemption in coin, a private financial siege that could break an overextended issuer in days. The result, documented in the region's clearing records, was that a note from a small bank in rural Maine spent as easily in Boston as coin. Economists still argue about whether the Suffolk was a public-spirited stabilizer or a Boston cartel muscling the countryside, but either way, one private bank was performing the discipline function of a central bank decades before America officially had one. Case 3 is the strangest of the 3, Chicago. Wisconsin's early constitution and Illinois politics were deeply hostile to banks. So a Scottish investor named George Smith found a door where the wall was supposed to be. In 1839, he obtained a charter for the Wisconsin Marine and Fire Insurance Company, an insurance company, explicitly not a bank. The company then began issuing certificates of deposit in small, round, convenient denominations, which looked like banknotes, folded like banknotes, and spent like banknotes. Everyone understood what they were. They were called George Smith's money. And here is the reversal. Smith's operation, managed by his associate Alexander Mitchell, redeemed every certificate in coin on demand without fail through every panic that killed chartered banks around it. Rivals organized runs against it, and the counter paid out until the runs gave up. By the early 1850s, contemporary estimates put well over $1 million of these certificates in circulation, and some accounts suggest they made up the bulk of the money actually changing hands in Chicago. The paper of a company legally forbidden to be a bank had become the most trusted currency in the region, while paper blessed by state law rotted in the reporters' worthless columns. Sit with that for a second, because it is the era's real lesson. The value of money in this system came from the redeemer's behavior, not from the government's permission. Which brings us to how it ended, and I promised you the ending is not a ban. It is 5 moves, executed by Congress between 1862 and 1866, under the pressure of the Civil War and the direction of Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase. Move 1, 1862, the Legal Tender Act. Facing war costs that gold payments could not cover, Congress authorized the first national paper currency since the founding era, the United States notes, printed with green ink and immediately nicknamed greenbacks. For the first time in a generation, there was a federal paper dollar, and it was declared legal tender for debts. The private notes now had a national competitor. Move 2, 1863, the National Currency Act. Rather than outlaw state banks, Congress built a parallel system, federally chartered national banks, which were required to buy United States government bonds and deposit them with the Treasury as backing for a new, uniform national banknote. Notice the design. It is the free banking bond deposit model, the same machine Michigan built in 1837, but with a single sovereign issuer of the collateral and a single standardized note design, and with the war financed as a side effect, since every new national bank was a forced buyer of war bonds. Move 3, 1864, the National Banking Act proper, which rewrote and tightened the 1863 law, fixed its supervision problems, and created the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency to examine the new banks, a federal agency that still exists and still supervises national banks today. Move 4 is the kill shot, and it is one sentence of tax law. The state banks were not converting fast enough. Their notes still circulated, their charters were often looser, and many saw no reason to trade state freedom for federal supervision. So in March of 1865, Congress imposed a 10% tax on state banknotes paid out by any bank, taking effect in 1866. Think about what a 10% tax means for an object whose entire profit margin is a sliver of interest. It does not restrict the business. It vaporizes it. No state banknote could survive losing 10% of its face value every time it moved. The notes were never declared illegal. They were simply made unprofitable to exist, and within roughly 2 years they were gone from circulation, with the number of state-chartered banks collapsing from over 1,000 in the early 1860s to a few hundred by 1868 as banks rushed to convert to national charters. And Move 5 is what happened at the Supreme Court because a state bank challenged the tax as an unconstitutional destruction of a state-authorized business. In 1869, in a case called Viazzi Bank against Fenno, the court upheld it, ruling in substance that Congress may use its taxing power to drive rival currencies out of existence in order to secure a uniform national currency. That precedent has never been overturned. The 10% tax remained federal law deep into the 20th century, a loaded weapon left on the shelf. 8,000 species of American money, the entire ecosystem the Singapore note belonged to, ended not with soldiers or seizures, but with a tax rate and a court opinion. Now, the part that reframes everything you just heard. The state banks did not die in 1866. Only their notes did. Deprived of the printing press, the surviving state banks leaned into a different product they already offered, the checking account. A check, after all, is also a private promise to pay. It just carries a name and a signature instead of an engraved border. Deposits could not be taxed like notes, and over the following decades, deposit money, money that exists as entries on private bank ledgers, grew to dwarf physical currency entirely. Economic historians have pointed out the irony for a century. Congress killed private paper money and in doing so accelerated private ledger money, which is the form nearly all money takes now. Check the figures published by the Federal Reserve, and you will find that physical cash is a small fraction of the money supply. The rest is deposits created and destroyed on the books of commercial banks when they lend, which means the everyday dollars in your account are, functionally, the great-grandchildren of George Smith's certificates. Private bank promises that we treat as money because the redeemer has so far always paid. The caveat, and it is a real one, is that today's version sits inside a lattice the wildcat era never had. A central bank as lender of last resort since 1913, and federal deposit insurance since the 1930s, both of which were built as direct answers to the failures this episode described. But the core architecture, private institutions issuing the money most people actually use, survived the 10% tax without a scratch. It just stopped being printed where you could see it, so return one last time to that $3 note from Singapore, Michigan. The town it named was abandoned by the 1870s after the lumber ran out, and the Dunes moved in and buried it, which makes the note one of the only artifacts proving the place existed at all. It is easy to file it away as a relic of a naive age. I think the record supports a harder reading. The note is a receipt from a 25-year national experiment in fully private money, an experiment that produced spectacular frauds in the Michigan woods, a functioning private central bank in Boston, and an insurance company in Chicago whose word was better than gold, and that ended when the federal government discovered that it did not need to ban a currency, only to tax it. Every argument you hear today about who should be allowed to issue money, banks, governments, technology companies, is a rerun of an argument Americans already ran at full scale, with real losses, between 1837 and 1866. The evidence is sitting in the collector catalogs priced, ironically, far above $3 now. If this kind of buried history is why you are here, subscribe to the channel and tap the like button so the algorithm surfaces it for the next person. And I will see you in the next one.